The millionaire heard his wife say on the phone, "I have already replaced all his medicine with poison. Tomorrow we will be free." That night, he secretly swapped her medicine with his, and what happened the next morning shocked everyone. It was a peaceful afternoon in Dallas when Joanna Whitmore arrived at her son's imposing mansion. At 65 years old, she maintained a natural elegance, reflected in her well-groomed grey hair and the floral dress she used to wear on special occasions. In her wrinkled hands, she carried a basket of homemade sweets that her son had so enjoyed since childhood. The mansion, located in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, displayed an architecture that blended Mexican colonial with modern touches. The well-tended gardens exuded the fragrance of the region's typical flowers, creating a welcoming atmosphere that contrasted with the grandeur of the property. Joanna smiled as she thought about how her son, Lucas Whitmore, had achieved such success at such a young age. Upon ringing the doorbell, Joanna was greeted by one of the house staff, who opened the gate with a surprised expression. "Mrs. Joanna, we weren't expecting your visit today," said the employee, leading her to the main entrance. Joanna noticed something strange in the employee's tone of voice, but chose not to give it importance. "I came to surprise my son. I brought the sweets he loves so much," she replied, raising the decorated basket. The employee hesitated for a moment before informing her that Lucas was on a business trip. "Mr. Lucas is abroad, ma'am. He should be back in a few days," she explained, visibly uncomfortable. Joanna felt a pang of disappointment but decided to visit her daughter-in-law, Madeline Blake, the young pharmacist who had won her son's heart. As she walked along the mansion's corridors, Joanna observed the details of the decor her daughter-in-law had chosen. Something about the atmosphere seemed different, colder perhaps. The paintings on the walls, the silk curtains, everything seemed too immaculate, as if hiding something behind such perfection. Madeline must be in her private office, the employee informed her, indicating the path Joanna knew well. In the hallway leading to the office, Joanna began to hear muffled voices. She recognized Madeline's melodious laugh, but there was also a male voice that didn't belong to her son. Her heart accelerated slightly, while her steps became more cautious. The voices grew clearer as she approached the partially open office door. What Joanna witnessed in the following seconds would be etched in her memory forever. Through the slit of the door, she saw her daughter-in-law in the arms of Diana Bailey, the family's young driver. Madeline, with her long black hair loose, had her arms around the driver's neck as he kissed her with a familiarity that revealed this was not the lovers' first encounter. The basket of sweets slipped from Joanna's hands, falling to the floor with a dull thud that echoed down the hallway. The homemade chocolates scattered across the marble floor, rolling like small, colorful jewels. The noise alerted the couple, who immediately separated. Madeline, upon seeing her mother-in-law standing at the door, paled for an instant, but her expression soon transformed into something Joanna had never seen before. "Madeline, how could you?" Joanna whispered, her voice trembling with indignation and sadness. Diana, the driver, remained in an embarrassed silence, while Madeline adjusted her dress with a disturbing calm. "Mrs. Joanna, what an unpleasant surprise," said Madeline, her voice assuming a chilling tone that didn't match her angelic appearance. Joanna took a step back, her legs shaking. All the strength that had sustained her seemed to have been drained from her body. The words she wanted to say stuck in her throat as she watched her daughter-in-law walk towards her with feline elegance. The contrast between the Madeline everyone knew, the dedicated wife and respected professional, and this woman before her, was frightening. "Don't you dare tell your son anything," said Madeline, her dark eyes fixed on Joanna. The driver had silently disappeared, leaving the two women alone in the hallway. The tension was palpable, like a thread about to break. "You're destroying my son's life. He trusts you. He built a life by your side," Joanna replied, regaining some of her composure. Madeline let out a cold laugh that echoed through the walls. "Built a life? Your son built an empire, Mrs. Joanna." "An empire that will soon be mine," she declared, moving closer. Her heels clicked on the floor like a hammer sealing a sentence. "While he travels the world, expanding his business, I take care of everything here, absolutely everything." Joanna felt her heart tighten as she realized her daughter-in-law's true nature. "You planned this from the beginning, to win his trust, become part of the company. And now," her voice failed as she grasped the extent of the betrayal. Madeline smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Your son is brilliant in business, but so naive when it comes to love. It was so easy to make him fall in love. The once spacious hallway seemed to narrow around Joanna. The ornate walls, which she had always admired, now seemed silent witnesses to a cruel plot. I'll tell him everything, every detail of what I saw today, Joanna declared, her voice trembling with indignation. Madeline took another step towards her, her presence now threatening. You won't tell anyone anything, Madeline whispered, her tone of voice changing to something darker. You know why? Because if you do, your beloved son will discover terrible things about his mother. Joanna felt a chill run down her spine. What are you talking about? She asked, instinctively backing away. Madeline smiled again, her white teeth contrasting with her red lipstick. I have proof that you embezzled money from your son's company, very convincing documents showing suspicious transfers to overseas accounts. Joanna paled. That's a lie. You're making that up, she exclaimed, her voice rising an octave. Truth or lie, it doesn't matter. What matters is that your son will believe it. After all, I'm the one who takes care of the company's finances, Madeline explained, her voice dripping with venom. I can only imagine how he would react to finding out that his own mother robbed him. The shame, the disappointment. It would be devastating. Joanna felt her legs weaken. The air seemed to grow heavier, harder to breathe. You can't do this. You can't destroy our family like this, she pleaded, leaning against the wall to keep from falling. Madeline observed the scene with clinical interest, as if studying a lab rat in an experiment. I can and I will, if necessary. So I suggest you keep that mouth shut and continue being the kind mother-in-law everyone knows, she declared. Otherwise, not only will your son lose all respect for you, but he'll also discover documents proving your involvement in tax fraud. I can't imagine prison is a pleasant place for a lady of your age. It was at that moment that Joanna felt a sharp pain in her chest. The stress of the situation, the threats, the discovery of betrayal, it all transformed into an unbearable pressure on her heart. She brought her hand to her chest, her eyes wide with panic. My heart, I need my medicine, she whispered, sliding down the wall to the floor. Madeline watched her mother-in-law slide to the ground, an expression of cruel satisfaction on her face. Joanna tried to breathe, her trembling hands clutching her chest as the pain intensified. Please, help, she murmured, but Madeline remained motionless, merely observing. What a dramatic scene, Mrs. Joanna, Madeline commented, crouching beside her mother-in-law. Perhaps this will teach you not to meddle where you're not wanted. With a deliberate motion, she removed the small bottle of pills from the pocket of Joanna's dress, keeping it for herself. The pain in Joanna's chest intensified, her breathing becoming shallower. The hallway began to spin in her vision, the colors blending like an abstract painting. She tried to scream, but her voice was no more than a hoarse whisper. Her eyes pleaded for help, finding only Madeline's icy gaze. You know, Mrs. Joanna, you should have stayed home with your sweets and recipes, Madeline said, adjusting a lock of hair. Now you're here, having such a convenient heart attack. She stood up, smoothing her dress with meticulous gestures as she watched her mother-in-law lose consciousness. Joanna's body finally gave in, sliding fully to the floor. Her eyes closed, and her breathing, though present, was irregular and weak. Madeline took out her phone, but instead of calling an ambulance, she began taking pictures of her unconscious mother-in-law. This will be useful later, she murmured to herself, putting the phone away. Who knows, I might need to prove that you have more serious health problems? With one last look at Joanna's motionless body, Madeline began walking towards the exit of the hallway, her heels echoing in the silence. The maid who had received Joanna earlier was doing her routine cleaning when she reached the hallway. The shock of seeing Mrs. Whitmore lying on the floor made her drop her cleaning supplies. "Mrs. Joanna!" she shouted, running towards the body. Madeline, in her office, heard the maid's scream echo through the mansion's corridors. With calculated calm, she walked to her mahogany desk and sat in the leather chair, observing the chaos unfolding outside. She smiled, thinking that everything was going even better than planned. She took out her phone and, with nimble fingers, typed a message to Diana. The old lady fell ill after what she saw. Don't worry, I'll make sure she stays quiet. Keep acting normally. After sending the message, she spent a few minutes contemplating the screen, savoring every word written. the sound of alarmed voices from the staff mixed with the distant wail of an approaching siren. Madeline stood up and walked to the window, watching the arrival of the ambulance. Her heels echoed on the marble floor as she planned her next steps. Poor mother-in-law, she murmured to herself ironically. Who could have imagined she'd have a heart attack today of all days? She returned to her desk, organized some papers, and prepared to play the role of the devoted and concerned daughter-in-law. Her plan was just beginning, and she would ensure that Joanna never again posed a threat. On the other side of the corridor, the maid held Joanna's hand, feeling her weak pulse. "Someone call an ambulance!" she cried desperately as other maids ran in different directions. Chaos erupted in the mansion, exactly as Madeline had planned. The ambulance would arrive in a few minutes, its sirens cutting through the silence of the upscale neighborhood. But for Joanna, every second seemed an eternity as she unconsciously fought for her life, unaware that this was only the beginning of a much darker plan. The white lights of Dallas Central Hospital reflected on Joanna's pale face as she was rushed down the emergency hallways on a gurney. Madeline walked right behind, her high heels echoing rhythmically on the floor, contrasting with the frenzy of doctors and nurses around her. The medical team worked quickly, connecting monitors and checking the patient's vital signs. Dr. Miguel Sanchez, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a serious expression, examined Joanna with meticulous attention. Madeline observed every move, her dark eyes missing not a single detail. "Mrs. Blake," the doctor called, turning to Madeline. "Your mother-in-law had a mild cardiac episode. Fortunately, the rescue was quick, and we managed to stabilize her." Madeline kept her perfectly rehearsed, concerned expression, while inwardly seething with frustration at her mother-in-law's survival. The emergency room was filled with state-of-the-art equipment, and the constant beep of the heart monitor was the only thing breaking the tense silence. The nurses moved efficiently around the bed, adjusting medications and checking vital signs. Madeline remained standing, an elegant statue, her mind already working on the next step of her plan. "Doctor," her melodious voice cut through the air, "as a pharmaceutical director, I'm especially concerned. I've noticed some strange behaviors in my mother-in-law in the past few days." The doctor looked up from his notes, interested. "What kind of behaviors, Mrs. Blake?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. Madeline approached the bed, her fingers sliding gently over the metal railing. "Mental confusion, sudden mood swings. I thought it was just stress. But now—" She left the sentence hanging, planting the first seed of her elaborate lie. "Doctor," Sanchez made some notes in her chart as Madeline continued her performance. "I've also noticed she's been having trouble remembering recent events. I thought it was just natural aging, but as a healthcare professional, I confess I'm concerned about something more serious." At this moment, Joanna began to slowly awaken. Her eyes opened with difficulty, and she tried to focus her vision on the surroundings. Seeing Madeline at her bedside, a flicker of fear crossed her gaze. Where am I?" she mumbled weakly. "At the hospital, Mrs. Whitmore," the doctor replied, approaching to examine her. "You had a cardiac episode, but you're stable now." Joanna tried to move, but her body seemed too heavy. Her eyes met Madeline's, who smiled sweetly, a perfect mask of concern covering her true intentions. "I need to talk," Joanna tried to say, but her voice was just a whisper. Madeline quickly intervened. "Doctor, see how confused she is." "This is exactly what I was saying. These disorientation episodes have been becoming more frequent." Joanna tried to maintain consciousness as she watched Madeline masterfully manipulate the situation. "Doctor." Sanchez continued making notes, occasionally casting worried glances her way. The feeling of helplessness grew in her chest, along with the fear of what her daughter-in-law was planning. At a moment when the doctor stepped away to attend to another patient, Madeline approached the bed. "I warned you to keep quiet, didn't I?" she whispered, checking the IV bag with a professional interest that disguised her true intentions. "Now I'll make sure no one believes a word you say." With precise, discreet movements, Madeline withdrew a syringe from her white coat. Years of experience as a pharmaceutical executive made her gestures natural and imperceptible to any casual observer. "A little cocktail I developed especially for occasions like this," she murmured, injecting the liquid into the IV. Joanna watched in horror, unable to move or scream. The medication began to take effect almost immediately, making her vision blurred and her thoughts confused. The walls of the room seemed to undulate, and the voices around her turned into a distant echo. Madeline put the syringe away and headed to the nurse's station, where Joanna's medical records were being updated. With her authority as the hospital's pharmaceutical director and years of built-up influence, she had easy access to the documents. Her skilled hands altered crucial information, turning a simple cardiac issue into a much more complex diagnosis. "As I suspected," she told Dr. Sanchez when he returned. "The test shows significant changes. It's not just a cardiac problem, doctor. The neurological symptoms are concerning." She presented the altered documents with a conviction that only years of manipulation could produce. The doctor examined the new data with growing concern. "This is more serious than we thought," he agreed, watching Joanna now mumble disconnected words, the effect of the medication administered by Madeline. "We need a more thorough evaluation." Madeline nodded gravely. "Doctor, as you know, we can set up a complete medical wing at the mansion. I believe it would be best to transfer her there, where I can monitor her personally." Her voice conveyed professional concern that perfectly masked her true intentions. "With your experience and resources, I agree that would be best for her," the doctor responded. "I'll arrange the transfer immediately." Madeline smiled softly, savoring her victory. Joanna, in her bed, struggled against the mental fog enveloping her, only vaguely aware of the danger that awaited her. Joanna's transfer to the mansion was arranged with impressive efficiency. Madeline personally supervised the installation of the medical equipment in the prepared room, transforming it into a private infirmary. The light walls and modern equipment created a hospital atmosphere that perfectly disguised her sinister intentions. While the nurses adjusted the monitors and organized the medications, Madeline reviewed the falsified documentation. Every detail had been meticulously planned to sustain her version of the facts. The medical record now indicated a progressive neurological condition, typical of advanced age, which would justify any confused behavior Joanna might exhibit. "Vital signs are stable," one of the nurses informed. "Medication is being administered as prescribed." Madeline nodded, satisfied. The cocktail of drugs she had developed would keep her mother-in-law in a constant state of confusion, unable to clearly articulate her accusations. Joanna, lying in her new medical prison, watched the movement around her with half-closed eyes. The drugs in her system made it difficult to distinguish reality from hallucination. The shadows on the walls seemed to dance, and the voices blended into a distorted symphony. "Now, dear mother-in-law," Madeline whispered, leaning over the bed after everyone had left, "let's make sure your stories are just delusions of a confused mind." Her fingers adjusted the IV drip, ensuring the dosage kept Joanna exactly where she wanted her. Night fell over the mansion, enveloping the room in elongated shadows. Madeline made a final check of the equipment before leaving, satisfied with the outcome of her plan. In the hallway, she took out her phone and typed a quick message to Diana. "Everything is under control. The mother-in-law won't be a problem anymore." Joanna, alone in her room prison, struggled against the weight of the drugs in her system. In a moment of lucidity, she tried to reach for the emergency button near the bed, but her movements were slow and uncoordinated. The last thing she saw before sinking back into darkness was Madeline's victorious smile through the crack in the door. In the mansion's library, Madeline contemplated the sunset through the tall windows while holding the phone in her delicate hands. The moment demanded perfection. Every word, every intonation had to convey the sincere concern of a devoted wife. Her fingers slid across the cell phone screen, dialing Lucas's number. The antique clock on the wall struck exactly 8 o'clock when her husband's deep voice sounded on the other end of the line. Madeline let out a studied sigh as if holding back tears. "My love," her voice trembled just the right amount, "something terrible has happened to your mother." Lucas, who was in his office at a luxury hotel abroad, felt his heart tighten as he heard those words. His wife's momentary silence only increased his anxiety. "What happened to my mother, Madeline? Please tell me." His normally controlled voice now carried a note of desperation. "Your mother came for a surprise visit," Madeline began, measuring every word. At first she seemed normal, but then she started acting strange. She was talking nonsense, seeming confused. She paused dramatically, letting the concern grow on the other end of the line. Suddenly, she had a medical episode. Thank God I was here to help her. The library, with its antique bookshelves and elegant furniture, served as the perfect backdrop for her performance. Madeline moved to a leather armchair, her posture impeccable even when alone. The doctors discovered it's not just a physical issue, dear. They identified a serious neurological condition, possibly age-related. What do you mean, a neurological condition? Lucas's voice sounded increasingly distressed. My mother has always been so lucid, so active. Madeline smiled discreetly as she sensed the growing despair in his words. I know, my love. That's why I made all the arrangements. I turned the guest room into a fully equipped infirmary. Your mother will have the best care right here at home. As she detailed the medical provisions she had made, Madeline walked around the library, her heels echoing on the hardwood floor. I used my contacts at the hospital to ensure the best equipment. Your mother is being monitored 24 hours a day. Her voice conveyed a calculated mixture of professional efficiency and familial concern. I need to return immediately, Lucas declared, and Madeline could hear the sound of papers being hastily organized. I'll arrange a flight today. It was exactly the reaction she had expected. Of course, my love. Your mother will be happy to see you in her more lucid moments. The conversation ended with Madeline promising to keep Lucas updated on any changes in his mother's condition. After hanging up the phone, she allowed a genuine smile to appear on her lips. Everything was going according to plan. So predictable, she murmured to herself, tucking the cell phone into her designer bag. With determined steps, Madeline made her way down the corridor toward the room where Joanna was admitted. The sound of medical equipment filled the space, creating a mechanical symphony that masked her true intentions. Through the glass door, she observed her mother-in-law lying surrounded by monitors and machines. How is our patient doing? She asked the nurse leaving the room. With a nod, she dismissed the staff member and entered, locking the door behind her. Joanna tried to move at the sight of her, but the medications made her movements slow and uncoordinated. How you know, dear mother-in-law, Madeline began, adjusting the IV drip with precise motions. Your son is coming home. He's very worried about your condition. Her skilled fingers checked the equipment connections as she spoke. It's a pity that when he arrives, he'll find only a confused and disoriented old lady. Joanna tried to speak, but her tongue felt too heavy. Her eyes, however, remained alert, following each of Madeline's movements with growing terror. The daughter-in-law continued her cruel monologue, savoring the power she exerted over the situation. It must be terrible, Madeline went on, leaning over the bed, being trapped in your own body, aware of everything, but unable to communicate. Watching your own son be deceived right before your eyes. Her smile was icy as she prepared a new dose of medication. The room's light reflected off the medical instruments, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Madeline moved with the grace of a predator, each gesture calculated to maximize her victim's terror. Do you know what's most interesting? The more you try to alert him, the more you'll confirm my false diagnosis. In a moment of clarity, Joanna managed to emit unintelligible sounds, her hands trembling as she tried to reach for the emergency button. Madeline laughed softly, removing the device from her mother-in-law's reach. No, dear. We won't be calling anyone to interrupt our family chat. The heart monitor registered an acceleration in Joanna's heartbeats, but Madeline showed no concern. Your heart's racing? Don't worry, I have something that will help with that too. Her voice dripped false sweetness as she prepared another syringe. Your son will be here soon, Madeline continued, injecting the fluid into the IV line. And do you know what's best? He'll see me as the dedicated daughter-in-law who sacrificed everything to care for his dear sick mother. Isn't it ironic? Joanna felt tears streaming down her face as darkness began to envelop her once more. The tension in the room reached its peak as Madeline administered more medications into the IV drip. Joanna, semi-conscious, watched in terror as her daughter-in-law's transformation unfolded, the sweet smile giving way to an expression of calculated cruelty. I should thank you for your surprise visit, dear mother-in-law, Madeline whispered, checking the monitors. Thanks to it, I was able to accelerate my plans. Soon, everything Lucas built will be mine. Her fingers slid along the IV tube, adjusting the flow of the adulterated medication. The room, now transformed into a private medical prison, silently witnessed the unfolding of the diabolical plan. The equipment continued its steady beeping, marking time like a somber metronome. Joanna struggled to maintain consciousness, but each moment grew increasingly hazy. When Lucas arrives, Madeline went on, meticulously organizing the medication vials, he'll find only a confused elderly woman, delirious about conspiracies and betrayals. And I, of course, will be the devoted daughter-in-law who abandoned her career to care for her sick mother-in-law. The sun was beginning to set, casting orange shadows through the windows. Madeline checked her wristwatch. Only a few hours remained until Lucas's arrival. She needed to ensure her mother-in-law was fully sedated by then. "I'll let you rest now," she announced, heading for the door. "Oh, and don't worry about your son. I promise I'll take very good care of him too." The smile on her lips carried a sinister promise that made Joanna shudder. Joanna tried to scream, but only a feeble moan escaped her lips. Her eyes, wide with terror, followed Madeline as she exited the room. The poison in her veins was taking effect, making each thought more muddled than the last. "Good night, dear mother-in-law," were Madeline's last words before closing the door. Out in the hallway, her delicate hands reached for the phone in her designer purse, a satisfied smile dancing on her perfectly painted lips. With nimble fingers, she typed a message to Diana. All set for his arrival. The old lady won't be a problem anymore. Standing in front of the hallway window, Madeline watched the mansion's garden being swallowed by the night's darkness. Her thoughts drifted to the details of her plan as she awaited Diana's response. The phone vibrated softly in her hands. "Are you sure she won't be able to alert him?" the driver questioned. Madeline let out a low, cruel laugh, her fingers gliding across the cell phone screen as she replied, "Impossible. The cocktail I developed will keep her in a controlled vegetative state. Even if she tries to speak, it will seem like just another delusion from her neurological condition." She tucked the phone back into her purse and cast one last glance at the room's door where Joanna was imprisoned. The night promised to be long, but Madeline was prepared for every possible scenario. In a few hours, Lucas would be home, and she needed to ensure her performance as a devoted wife was flawless. With firm steps, she headed to her office to finalize the last details of her diabolical plan. Outside Joanna's room, the last rays of sunlight disappeared over the horizon, plunging the mansion into shadows. Joanna, in her bed, fought against the drug-induced slumber, silently praying for her son's safety. Morning had barely begun when Chloe entered the sick room carrying fresh bedding. Her 15 years of working at the Whitmore mansion had created an almost automatic routine, but something about that morning made her movements slow. Her eyes fixated on Mrs. Joanna, lying in the hospital bed, seemingly sedated. As she organized the linens in the closet, Chloe couldn't ignore the elderly woman's wide-open eyes, which seemed to plead for help. Having been the one who found Mrs. Joanna passed out days earlier, she felt a special responsibility to observe her condition. The patient's fingers moved incessantly over the white sheet, as if trying to communicate something. "Mrs. Joanna," Chloe whispered cautiously, approaching the bed. "Can you hear me?" The heart monitor registered a change in the beats, indicating the patient was conscious and reacting. Chloe looked towards the door, making sure she was alone before moving closer. Mrs. Joanna's eyes followed every movement of the maid, while her fingers continued their silent ballet on the sheet. Chloe noticed that, despite the supposed neurological condition, the lady's gaze was very lucid, full of an urgency that contrasted with her apparently debilitated state. "Has something happened, Mrs. Joanna? Are you trying to tell me something?" Chloe's heart raced as she realized tears were starting to roll down the lady's face. It was evident that something was terribly wrong. How could a woman who just a few days ago was completely lucid, bringing sweets for her son, now be in this state? The doubts that had already inhabited her mind since the initial incident began to take on a more concrete form. Carefully, Chloe leaned over the bed, whispering, "If you can understand me, blink twice." Mrs. Joanna's face lit up momentarily, and she blinked, clearly and deliberately, twice. "My God," murmured Chloe, "you're conscious, aren't you? What have they done to you?" The tension in the room was palpable, as Chloe tried to decipher the movements of Mrs. Joanna's fingers. It was as if the lady was trying to write in the air, her fingers tracing invisible letters. "Do you want to write something?" asked Chloe, her heart beating harder and harder against her chest. At that moment, an almost imperceptible noise made Chloe freeze. Before she could turn around, a soft and controlled voice cut through the air like a blade. "What exactly are you doing, Chloe?" The maid felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized Mrs. Madeline's voice. The tension in the room increased exponentially with Madeline's presence. Chloe turned slowly, finding her employer standing at the door, her dark eyes fixed on her like those of a predator. The polite smile on her face contrasted with the coldness of her gaze. "Mrs. Madeline, I was just changing the bedsheets and checking if Mrs. Joanna needed anything," Chloe replied, trying to keep her voice steady. But her hands trembled slightly as she held the clean sheet, betraying her nervousness. Behind her she could feel Mrs. Joanna's silent anguish. "How touching a dedication," Madeline commented, gently closing the door behind her. The click of the lock sounded like a sentence. "But I wonder if you're not being too dedicated, Chloe. After all, your duties do not include interacting with the patient." Her heels echoed on the floor as she approached, each step increasing the tension in the room. "You know, Chloe," Madeline continued, her voice taking on a dangerously soft tone, "I've always appreciated your loyalty to the family. Your children are doing well in private schools, aren't they?" She slowly circled the maid, like a snake surrounding its prey. "Little Miguel, so smart, top of the class in math, and sweet Lupita, with such a talent for music. That violin we gave her last Christmas was quite a gift, wasn't it?" Madeline stopped in front of Chloe, her piercing black eyes staring. "And that house in the new neighborhood. So beautiful, isn't it? 3 bedrooms, a front garden, even a little vegetable patch in the back where you grow your herbs. A real dream for a maid." She smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It must be comforting to know that your children sleep safely every night, in their own beds in a decent neighborhood." Her delicate fingers played with a pendant on her necklace as she continued. "It would be a shame if something happened to all of that. Just imagine, Miguel and Lupita having to leave their friends, their teachers, all that structure we've provided, going back to a public school in the outskirts where violence is so common." She paused deliberately, watching the terror grow in Chloe's eyes. "And that cozy little house. In a matter of days, you could be looking for a room in some cheap boarding house. You know what life is like in the city's boarding houses, Chloe. No place to raise children." Chloe felt her heart miss a beat. Years of hard work, her children's future, everything depended on this job. "Mrs. Madeline, I would never," she began to say, but was interrupted by a brusque gesture from her employer. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I want you to understand very clearly what I'm about to say." Madeline moved closer, her expensive perfume mingling with the antiseptic air of the room. "If you keep meddling where you shouldn't, you won't just lose your job, but I guarantee you won't get work anywhere in the United States. Your children will go back to public schools, and that beautiful house?" She laughed softly. "Well, you'll have to find another place to live." "And don't think I'm bluffing," Madeline whispered, her lips almost touching Chloe's ear. "You know that doctor friend of Miguel's who helped your son with his broken arm for free? He's already been warned to never attend to your family again. As for your daughter—" She paused, a cruel smile forming. "It would be terrible if someone spread certain rumors about her at school. Teenagers can be so cruel, can't they? And that medicine your father takes for his heart. How tragic it would be if it were switched for something that worsened his condition instead of helping." Madeline adjusted her posture, smoothing her dress. "And don't worry. When the police find drugs planted in your home, I'll be sure to be the first to show shock and disappointment. After all, who could have imagined that a trusted maid was involved in drug trafficking? All because a mother didn't know how to stay in her place, quiet, like a good servant should." Mrs. Joanna's heart monitor registered increasingly rapid beats, reflecting the terror of the scene unfolding before her. Chloe could feel the weight of tears accumulating in her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Madeline," she replied in a trembling voice. The tense moment was interrupted by the sound of voices coming from the hallway. Madeline's face instantly changed, the mask of cruelty giving way to an expression of concern and dedication. "Lucas?" she called, her sweet and loving voice echoing through the room. "We're in here, my love." The door opened, revealing Lucas Whitmore, still in his travel suit, concern etched on his face. His eyes immediately fixed on the figure of his mother lying in the hospital bed. "Mum," he whispered, quickly approaching. Madeline followed him, her hands gently resting on his shoulders in a calculated show of support. "How is she?" Lucas asked, his voice thick with emotion. Chloe remained in a corner of the room watching as Mrs. Joanna struggled to communicate with her son, her fingers moving frantically, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Oh, my love," Madeline replied, letting a few studied tears escape. "We're doing everything we can." Madeline enveloped her husband in an embrace, positioning herself so that he couldn't fully see his mother's face. "Don't worry," she said, her voice choked with false emotion. "I've assembled the best medical team. We're all committed to helping her recover." As she spoke, she cast a meaningful glance at Chloe. Lucas stepped closer to the bed, holding his mother's hand. "Why is she like this, so absent?" he questioned, noticing Joanna's uncoordinated movements. Madeline quickly intervened. "It's the medication, dear. It leaves her a bit confused, but it's necessary for her treatment." Joanna was desperately trying to communicate with her son, but her body wasn't responding as she wished. Her eyes filled with tears of frustration and fear. Sensing her mother-in-law's agitation, Madeline gently suggested, "Perhaps we should let her rest for a bit, love. You also need to rest from your trip." "Of course," Lucas agreed, kissing his mother's forehead. "Chloe, please keep taking good care of her," he requested, unaware of how the maid trembled slightly. "Yes, sir," she replied, avoiding looking at Madeline. "I'll do everything possible and impossible for Mrs. Joanna." As the couple headed for the door, Madeline paused for a moment, turning with studied elegance. Her eyes met Chloe's first, then Joanna's, a sweet smile on her lips contrasting with the cruelty in her gaze. She approached the maid one last time, adjusting her uniform in a falsely maternal gesture. "Remember, dear," she whispered, so that only Chloe could hear, "you have much more to lose than you can imagine. Your children, your parents, your dignity. It's all in my hands. And as for Mrs. Joanna," she cast an icy glare at her mother-in-law, "well, accidents happen to frail patients all the time, don't they? It would be a shame if she choked during feeding, or if some medication was accidentally switched." The door closed with a soft click, leaving the two women trapped in their shared terror. Chloe trembled, her legs barely supporting her weight, while Joanna let silent tears stream down her face. The sound of Madeline's heels echoing down the hallway was a sinister reminder that she could return at any moment, bringing with her more veiled threats and promises of destruction. In the elegant office of the mansion, Lucas Whitmore sat in his leather armchair, his eyes fixed on his mother's medical records scattered across the mahogany desk. The heavy curtains filtered the afternoon light, creating a gloomy atmosphere that matched his state of mind. Madeline remained standing by his side, her delicate hands resting on his shoulders in a studied show of support. "It doesn't make sense, Madeline," he murmured, running his fingers through his graying hair. "My mother never showed this kind of condition before. How could she develop such a severe neurological disorder out of nowhere?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anguish as he examined every document, every test result. Madeline moved with feline grace to the front of the desk, picking up one of the exams. "My love, unfortunately, it's more common than we realize. The doctor explained that with age, these conditions can manifest suddenly." She slid her finger along a complex graph on the paper. "See these changes here? They're typical of the condition your mother is presenting." The subtle aroma of Madeline's expensive perfume filled the room as she continued her explanation, blending technical terms with an apparent heartfelt concern. "As a pharmacist, I've seen similar cases. It's devastating, but we need to focus on providing her with the best possible treatment." Her words were carefully chosen, each syllable laden with false compassion. Lucas got up, walking to the window. The view of the well-tended garden normally calmed him, but at that moment, nothing seemed capable of quelling his restlessness. "It's just that," he hesitated, pressing his temples with his fingers. "She only had mild heart problems like me. We always kept everything under control with medication. How could this—" His sentence was interrupted by a sudden pressure in his chest. Lucas leaned against the wall, his face paling. Madeline rushed to him, the embodiment of a worried wife. "Your medicine, dear. You need to calm down. All this stress isn't good for your heart." She quickly opened a drawer of the desk, retrieving a bottle of medication. "Here, take this," she said, handing him the blood pressure pills along with a glass of water. Her dark eyes watched intently as he swallowed the medication. For a fleeting moment, a strange glint passed through her gaze, but it was quickly replaced by concern. "You need to rest before the meeting. Come on, I'll accompany you to the room." Lucas nodded, still breathing with difficulty. "You're right," he agreed, allowing her to guide him out of the office. "Perhaps I really do need to rest a bit. This whole situation is affecting me more than I thought." Madeline led Lucas to the master bedroom, her firm hands on his shoulders as she guided him through the mansion's hallways. As they walked, she continued her role as a devoted wife, murmuring words of comfort and assuring him that everything would be all right. In the room, she helped him settle into his enormous bed, adjusting the pillows with studied delicacy. "Rest, my love," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "I'll take care of everything while you regain your energy for the meeting." Lucas closed his eyes, exhausted by the combination of worry and discomfort. As soon as she was sure her husband was settled, Madeline left the room, silently closing the door behind her. Her elegant gait became more hurried as she headed towards the mansion's garage. A subtle smile played on her lips, very different from the concerned expression she had displayed moments before. In the garage, Diana was polishing one of the family's luxury cars. Upon hearing the sound of Madeline's heels, she looked up, a discreet smile forming on her young face. No words were exchanged, but the look they shared was laden with complicity and silent promises. Madeline slowly passed by her, her fingers lightly grazing the car's hood as she maintained eye contact with the driver. It was a silent dance they had practiced many times, a ballet of glances and subtle gestures that communicated much more than words could express. What they didn't realize was that Chloe was in the adjacent garden, pruning some roses. The maid froze as she witnessed that exchange of looks, her mind immediately making connections she would have preferred not to make. The roses in her hands trembled slightly as she observed the scene. Memories of a recent conversation with her friend Rosario, employed at another mansion in the neighborhood, invaded her mind. Rosario had spoken about an employer who was cheating on her husband with a partner. Secret meetings marked by glances and gestures similar to those she had just witnessed. The garden shears trembled in Chloe's hands as she tried to process what she was seeing. Madeline's threats still echoed in her ears, and now this new discovery added another layer of danger to her already precarious situation. The sound of approaching footsteps made Chloe quickly turn her attention back to the roses, feigning total concentration on her task. Her heart was pounding as she thought of Mrs. Joanna, Madeline's threats, and now this new revelation. Chloe kept her eyes down, focused on the roses while her mind worked frenetically. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Mrs. Joanna's unexplained state, Madeline's threats, and now this exchange of glances with the driver. Her hands trembled slightly as she cut another rosebud. Her friend Rosario's voice echoed in her memory. That's how it started. First the glances, then the hidden encounters. When the truth came out, it was too late. A drop of sweat ran down her forehead as she recalled how the story had ended, with the family shattered and lives ruined. On the other side of the garden, Madeline was still whispering to Diana. Her gestures were restrained, but laden with intimacy. Chloe watched out of the corner of her eye, her heart beating faster and faster. The resemblance to the story Rosario had told was frightening. The same studied elegance, the same conspiratorial smiles. A noise coming from Lucas's room made Madeline swiftly move away from the driver. In seconds, her demeanor changed completely, reverting to that of a devoted wife. It was a chilling transformation to witness, like a snake shedding its skin instantly. Chloe thought of Mrs. Joanna sedated in her prison room, desperately trying to warn her son about something. Now she was beginning to understand what the lady had witnessed, what had caused her sudden illness. The weight of this knowledge was crushing. The sun was starting to set on the horizon, casting orange shadows over the garden. Chloe gathered her gardening tools, her body moving automatically while her mind seethed. She was now trapped in a web much more complex and dangerous than she had imagined. Back in the kitchen, Chloe stored the gardening supplies with trembling hands. She needed to find a way to help Mrs. Joanna and her employer, but how could she do so without putting her own family at risk? Madeline's threat was still alive in her memory, each cruel word echoing in her thoughts. "Dinner will be served in an hour." Madeline's voice cut through the air, making Chloe jump in fright. The mistress was standing in the kitchen doorway, her sweet smile contradicting the threatening gleam in her eyes. "And Chloe, remember our agreement. Some things must remain in the family." As Madeline walked away, her heels echoing down the hallway like a clock marking the time of destruction, Chloe remained motionless in the kitchen. The weight of the secrets she now carried felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Rosario's words mingled with Madeline's threats in her mind. When they discovered the betrayal, it was too late. The family was destroyed. Somewhere in the mansion, the constant beeping of Mrs. Joanna's room monitors could be heard, a sinister reminder of what happened to those who dared to defy the lady of the house. Chloe looked at her trembling hands, thinking of her children, her family, Mrs. Joanna sedated in her medical prison, and her employer, who slept unaware that he was surrounded by serpents. The sun set on the horizon, tinting the kitchen with shades of orange that looked like diluted blood. Chloe could hear Diana and Madeline's muffled voices coming from the garden, their contained laughter sounding like sharp knives cutting through the air. The scent of the roses she had pruned still lingered on her hands, but now it seemed more like a funeral perfume than a garden fragrance. "My God," she whispered to herself, "what do I do now?" The shadows of night began to swallow the mansion, bringing with them the promise of more secrets, more threats, and more danger. In her chest, her heart beat like a frightened bird in a cage, while her mind screamed silently for a way out of this nightmare. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Chloe sneaked down the hallway towards Mrs. Joanna's room. Her heart was pounding so hard she feared the sound might give her away. Under the pretext of changing the bathroom towels, she carried a small pile of clean laundry, her best protection should she be discovered. The afternoon light filtered softly through the gaps in the curtain as she entered the room. Mrs. Joanna lay on the hospital bed, apparently asleep, but her eyes instantly opened at the sound of Chloe's steps. The terror in her gaze was evident, mixed with a silent plea that made the maid's heart tighten. "Mrs. Joanna," Chloe whispered, cautiously approaching the bed, "can you understand me?" The elderly woman's fingers began to move frantically across the sheet, her eyes fixed on Chloe's with a frightening intensity. It was as if all her vital force was concentrated in that gaze, in that desperate movement of her hands. Chloe watched the movements closely, trying to decipher what the lady was trying to communicate. Mrs. Joanna's fingers made a repetitive motion in the air, as if she were writing. "Do you want to write something?" Chloe asked, her heart racing even faster at the possibility of finally understanding what was happening. With trembling hands, Chloe rummaged through the pockets of her apron, finding a small notepad she used to list daily tasks and a pen. Time seemed to drag as she helped Mrs. Joanna hold the pen, supporting the pad so she could write. Mrs. Joanna's movements were slow and imprecise, but determined. Each word that appeared on the paper made Chloe's blood run cold. Madeline, driver, betrayal, poison. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible, but the message was as clear as crystal. Chloe's suspicions were confirmed in the worst possible way. A noise in the hallway made Chloe freeze. The unmistakable sound of Madeline's heels echoed through the corridors, approaching. With a quick motion, she folded the paper and hid it in her apron pocket. "I'll be back later," she whispered to Mrs. Joanna, whose eyes now overflowed with silent tears. Chloe managed to leave the room seconds before Madeline appeared in the hallway. Pretending to be busy with the towels, she greeted her mistress with a discreet nod and headed towards the laundry room, feeling the weight of the paper in her apron as if it were made of lead. The mansion's kitchen became Chloe's refuge as she tried to process what she had just discovered. Her hands trembled as she picked up the dishes to organize dinner, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The note in her apron seemed to burn, every word written by Mrs. Joanna echoing in her conscience. "If I tell the master and he doesn't believe," she muttered to herself, remembering the passionate look Lucas always directed at his wife. The fear of Madeline's reaction made her stomach churn. The threats were still fresh in her memory, every cruel word about her children, her home, her future. On the other hand, the terror in Mrs. Joanna's eyes haunted her. How could she remain silent, knowing that 2 lives were in danger? The word poison, shakily written on the paper, was an unbearable weight on her conscience. Every minute of silence could mean the difference between life and death. Chloe leaned against the kitchen sink, trying to control her panting breath. My children, Mrs. Joanna, my job. The words mingled in her mind like ingredients in a poisoned recipe. The future of her family depended on that job, the house provided by the family, her children's scholarships. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Before she could turn around, Lucas's deep and gentle voice filled the kitchen. Chloe, could you please prepare something quick for me to eat? I have a meeting in half an hour. She slowly turned around, finding her employer standing at the door, his expression laden with concern. Of course, sir, she replied automatically, her hands starting to tremble again. As she prepared a sandwich, she observed the man who had done so much for her family. Lucas leaned against the counter, sighing heavily. You know, Chloe, I can't stop thinking about my mother. I'm afraid of losing her. The paper in the apron seemed to weigh a ton. Chloe looked at her employer, seeing the genuine pain in his eyes, the fear of loss, the confusion in the face of his mother's inexplicable situation. The decision began to form in her heart, overcoming the fear of consequences. Mr. Lucas, her voice came out trembling, her hands gripping the apron. I need to show you something. With trembling fingers, she took the folded paper out of her pocket. Your mother wrote this today. I think you need to see it. Lucas took the paper, his eyes scanning the shaky words written by his mother. Lucas's expression gradually changed as he read, disbelief giving way to confusion, then a shadow of doubt. This can't be true, he muttered, but his tone betrayed a growing uncertainty. Madeline would never. His voice failed, the words dying in his throat. Sir, Chloe continued, mustering all her courage, I think you should observe more closely. Some things that happen in the mansion. Her hands were still shaking, but her voice found steadiness. Your mother is trying to tell us something important, and she's not as confused as everyone thinks. Lucas reread the note repeatedly, as if the words could change with each new reading. The word poison seemed to leap off the paper, dancing before his eyes like a tangible threat. His hands began to tremble slightly, and he had to lean against the kitchen counter to keep his balance. Chloe, do you understand the gravity of what you're showing me? He asked, his voice low and controlled, but laced with growing tension. The maid nodded, aware that she had crossed a line of no return. Yes, sir. And I also know that I could lose everything by showing you this. But I can no longer keep this secret. The sound of Madeline's heels echoed somewhere in the mansion, making them both start. Lucas quickly tucked the note into the pocket of his jacket, his face assuming a neutral expression that betrayed none of the inner storm that was beginning to form. Don't say anything to anyone about this, Chloe. Not even that you showed me this paper. As he walked towards the kitchen door, Lucas paused for a moment, his hand gripping the note in his pocket. He said nothing more, but his gaze met Chloe's, carrying a mixture of gratitude and determination. The maid understood the silent message. He would investigate the truth on his own. After Lucas left, Chloe remained in the kitchen, her heart beating erratically. Through the window, she could see Madeline in the garden, beautiful and elegant in her expensive dress, talking on the phone with a smile on her lips. The same Madeline who, hours earlier, had threatened to destroy her life. The sound of Mrs. Joanna's room monitors continued their constant beeping, like a sinister reminder of the danger that hung over the mansion. Chloe closed her eyes, silently praying that she had made the right choice. The fate of everyone now depended on what Lucas would do with that information. The sun was beginning to set over the Dallas horizon, casting elongated shadows through the mansion's corridors. In her prison room, Mrs. Joanna continued her silent struggle against the drugs that kept her captive, while her son, for the first time since it all began, was starting to see the shadows that hid behind the perfect facade of his marriage. Hours later, Lucas Whitmore stared out the window of his office at the company, the words of his mother's note echoing in his mind. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent on the horizon when he made his decision. Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day, he instructed his secretary over the intercom, as he put away some documents in his briefcase. The journey to the mansion never seemed so long, even with the private driver taking the fastest route. Lucas instructed him to drop him off 2 blocks away from home, something he had never done before. "I need to walk a bit," he lied, watching the car drive away. In truth, he didn't want his arrival to be announced. Entering through the back of the property, using the key he rarely used, Lucas felt like an intruder in his own home. The sound of the pool water reached his ears, and through a gap in the garden, he caught sight of Madeline lounging on a chaise, apparently distracted by her reading. Taking advantage of his wife's distraction, he moved silently until he entered the house. The empty corridors seemed different now, as if they harbored secrets he had never noticed before. His steps automatically led him to the office, where his mother's medical records were still organized on the table. With hands that he now noticed were slightly trembling, Lucas began to examine each document more closely. His years at the helm of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the United States had taught him to be meticulous. Something in the results didn't seem right, but he couldn't identify exactly what. Using his cell phone, he photographed each page of the records, taking care to capture every detail. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, sending the images to Dr. Martin Sanchez, the director of Central Hospital and a longtime friend who had been treating his mother for years. "I need your opinion urgently. Something seems wrong," he typed in the message. The wait for the response seemed endless. Lucas kept examining the documents, each minute increasing his suspicions. The sound of his cell phone vibrating almost made him drop the papers. Dr. Sanchez's message was direct and alarming. "Lucas, these tests have been tampered with. The reference patterns do not match standard protocols, and there are inconsistencies in the results that would be impossible under normal conditions." Lucas's blood ran cold in his veins. The words in his mother's note, which only hours earlier had seemed absurd, were beginning to take on a frightening weight. With silent steps, he headed to the room where his mother was hospitalized, his heart beating faster and faster against his chest. The hospital room was quiet, except for the constant beeping of the monitors. Mrs. Joanna seemed to be sleeping, but her eyes opened as Lucas approached the bed. He immediately noticed that despite the apparent sedation, his mother's gaze retained a harrowing lucidity. "Mom," he whispered, leaning close to her face, "I'm investigating what's going on. Can you understand me?" The slight movement of Joanna's eyes confirmed his suspicion. His mother was conscious, trapped in her own body by the medications. With visible difficulty, Joanna moved one of her hands, tremblingly pointing toward the medicine cabinet on the other side of the room. Lucas followed the indicated direction, observing the various bottles neatly lined up on the shelves. Years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry made his eyes narrow as he examined the labels. "There's something wrong with the meds, isn't there?" he asked, still in a low voice, feeling his heart accelerate. His mother's gaze filled with tears as she made a superhuman effort to confirm with an almost imperceptible nod. Lucas felt a wave of anger begin to grow in his chest. The complexity of the scheme was beginning to unfold before his eyes. The tampered tests, the suspicious medications, his mother's condition. Everything pointed to something much more sinister than he could have imagined. "I'll figure out what's going on, Mum. I promise," he whispered, gently squeezing Joanna's hand. Determined to confront Madeline, Lucas headed toward the pool area. The place was empty, the abandoned lounge chair still holding her magazine. The gentle breeze flipped the pages, as if mocking his search. A sound from the house caught his attention, his wife's voice. Following the sound, Lucas approached the hallway leading to the library silently. The door was ajar, and Madeline's voice flowed smoothly through the crack as she was on the phone. Something in her tone made him stop, hiding in the shadows of the hallway. It wasn't the sweet tone she usually used. There was something cold, calculated. "Don't worry." Her voice rang clear now. "I've already switched all his meds for poison. Tomorrow we'll be free." The words hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. He had to lean against the wall to keep from falling as his entire world crumbled at the sound of his wife's soft laughter. The mansion's library continued to echo with Madeline's phone conversation, but Lucas could no longer hear. The blood pulsed in his ears as he silently walked away, his legs moving by instinct, carrying him away from that devastating truth. Before he realized it, he found himself in his private study, the door locked behind him. His hands were shaking as he poured himself a double whiskey, trying to process the magnitude of what he had just discovered. Madeline's words replayed in his mind like a death sentence. "I've already switched all his meds for poison." The glass in his hands reflected the late afternoon light, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Every moment of his marriage played before his eyes like a distorted film. The smiles, the kisses, the words of love, it had all been an elaborate lie. His wife, the woman who had sworn to love him, was planning his death. The evidence lined up like pieces of a macabre puzzle. His mother's falsified tests, the suspicious medications, Mrs. Joanna's condition, the desperate note, and now the involuntary confession. "How could I have been so blind?" he muttered to himself, anger and pain mingling in his chest. The sound of Madeline's heels echoed down the hallway, passing by the study door. Lucas held his breath, his entire body tense. On the other side of the door, his potential assassin walked calmly, probably already savoring her future victory. The contrast between reality and appearance was nauseating. "My love," Madeline's melodious voice came through the door. "You're back early." Lucas closed his eyes, gathering all his strength to keep his voice steady. "Yes, dear, I'm just reviewing some documents." Every word was like poison on his tongue, an irony not lost on him. Night was falling over the mansion, and with it the realization that Lucas needed to make a decision. He couldn't simply confront Madeline. She was too clever, too careful. He needed to be smarter, more calculated. His life and his mother's depended on it. In her prison room, Mrs. Joanna continued her silent struggle against the medications keeping her captive. In the study, her son faced his own battle, planning his next move in this deadly game. Somewhere in the mansion, Madeline continued her role as the perfect wife, unaware that her mask had finally dropped. Lucas looked down at the glass in his hands once more, watching as the amber liquid danced with the tremor of his fingers. Madeline's words still echoed in his mind as he contemplated the weight of his discovery. His entire life had turned into a macabre play, where he was the unwitting protagonist, walking toward his own demise. The silence of the study was broken only by the ticking of the antique clock, each second marking the time he had left to find a way out. On the opposite wall, the photos from their wedding seemed to mock him. Madeline in her white dress, smiling with false innocence, plotting his downfall from the very beginning. "How to turn a game around where all the cards seem to be against me," he muttered to himself, rising to gaze out the window at the garden. Down below, the shadows of night were beginning to swallow the mansion, just as the shadows of betrayal had swallowed his marriage. Somewhere in that house, his would-be assassin continued her charade, likely already savoring a victory she deemed certain. Fate had placed an impossible choice in his hands, and now he needed to decide his next move. One thing was certain. He couldn't remain passive in the face of this threat. He needed to act, and swiftly. "Let the real game begin," he whispered, his eyes reflecting a grim determination as night fell over Dallas. The lights of Dallas glowed like fallen stars as Lucas drove aimlessly through the city streets. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly the knuckles had turned white. The weight of betrayal in his chest was nearly suffocating, each breath an ache as if the air were poisoned, an irony not lost on him. The Azteca Bar, an upscale establishment frequented by the city's elite, rose like a beacon in the night. Lucas parked his imported car and entered the sophisticated milieu, where muted lighting cast dancing shadows to the tune of live piano. The place was relatively empty at this hour, just as he needed. "The usual, Mr. Whitmore?" the waitress asked as he settled on the polished wood counter. He nodded, eyes fixed on the mirror behind the bottles, watching his own reflection. The man staring back at him looked to have aged 10 years in just a few short hours. The whiskey arrived, and Lucas drank it like water. The amber liquid burned his throat going down, but the physical pain was welcome. Anything to distract his mind from the image of Madeline plotting his demise. He ordered another, then another, letting the alcohol numb his senses. The waitress watched discreetly as she poured yet another. Lucas rarely drank beyond one glass, and never alone. Something in his expression must have betrayed his mindset, for she lingered nearby, keeping a respectful but vigilant distance. "You know," he said finally, his voice a mixture of bitterness and irony. "What would you do if you found out the person you loved was trying to poison you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and toxic. The waitress, accustomed to hearing customer confessions, tilted her head slightly. "Well, Mr. Whitmore," she replied with a half-smile, interpreting the question as morbid jest, "I'd probably poison her first." The flippant response, spoken in jest, hit Lucas like a thunderbolt. His eyes widened slightly, a dark smile beginning to form on his lips. It was so simple, so obvious. If Madeline planned to use his blood pressure medication as a weapon, why not turn her own vanity against her? The body aesthetic pills she took religiously every night. It was the perfect opportunity for a switch she would never suspect. The irony of the situation didn't escape him, using her own poison against her. It was poetic in a macabre sort of way. The waitress had already moved away, unaware her joke had planted the seed of an elaborate revenge in Lucas's mind. The idea spread through Lucas's mind like a toxin coursing through veins. With a clarity the alcohol hadn't managed to cloud, he plotted every detail of his retribution. Madeline had always been meticulous about her medications, hers and his. It was that predictability he would use against her. Back at the mansion, he went straight to the couple's bedroom. He knew Madeline would be at her aquatic exercise session, giving him ample time. With steady hands, he opened the drawer where she kept her precious body aesthetic pills. The bottle was exactly where it always was, her near-obsessive regularity now serving his purposes. With the precision years running a pharmaceutical company had afforded him, Lucas made the switch. Carefully, he removed the contents of Madeline's capsules, replacing them with what she'd prepared for him. Each movement calculated, every gesture precise. "Let's see who has the last laugh, my love," he murmured, setting everything back exactly as he'd found it. The hours that followed were an exercise in self-control. Over dinner, Lucas maintained his usual routine, discussing business, responding to Madeline's inquiries about his mother with properly measured concern. He watched her every move, each false smile, each studied gesture of feigned devotion. When it came time for bed, Madeline followed her nightly ritual as always. "Don't forget your medication, dear," she said sweetly, fetching him the water glass and blood pressure pills, her honeyed tone belying murderous intent. Lucas took the pills, observing the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Good night, my love," Madeline whispered, kissing his forehead before heading to her vanity. Lucas watched her reflection in the mirror as she opened the drawer, retrieving her body aesthetic capsules. The moment he'd been waiting for was upon them. "Sleep well, darling," he replied evenly, watching as she swallowed the capsules with a sip of water. The clock on the wall ticked each merciless second while they waited, she for her supposed victory, he for his calculated vengeance. The first signs came on subtly. Madeline brought a hand to her throat, eyes widening in confusion. Her legs began to weaken, and she had to lean on the vanity to keep from collapsing. "Lucas, something's wrong. I'm feeling strange," Madeline slurred, her voice failing as her legs buckled. She tried to brace herself on the vanity, but her fingers no longer obeyed. The bottle of her prized beauty pills rolled from her grasp, scattering capsules across the marble floor. "Help! Lucas! Help me!" Her words came out choked, the rising panic in her eyes as her body began to shake uncontrollably. She tried to drag herself towards the bathroom door, her movements as clumsy as those of a puppet with its strings cut. "I can't breathe." The dressing table mirror reflected the macabre scene. Madeline, always so elegant and composed, now writhing on the floor like a wounded animal. Her face, normally flawless thanks to the expensive treatments, was beginning to show the first signs of the poison. Bluish lips, dilated pupils, cold sweat running down her forehead. "Please, call an ambulance," she pleaded, her voice now no more than a hoarse whisper. Her terror-filled eyes met Lucas's, who remained motionless, watching her transformation from predator to prey. It was at this moment that the first glimmer of understanding crossed her gaze, the realization that her own plan had turned against her. Lucas rose calmly from the bed, observing Madeline writhing on the floor. The poison she had prepared for him now coursed through her own veins, and the irony of the situation did not escape him. "What's wrong, my love? The beauty drug's not working?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Madeline tried to speak, but only broken sounds escaped her throat. Her wide eyes, full of terror, met his, seeking an explanation. Sweat was starting to bead on her forehead as her limbs twisted involuntarily. "It's terrible, isn't it?" he continued, squatting down beside her with calculated elegance. To be aware but unable to control your own body, to feel every muscle betraying your commands, your tongue too heavy to form words, your eyes only able to convey terror. Exactly like my mother. He gently tucked a stray strand of Madeline's disheveled hair. The difference, my dear, is that my mother was innocent, while you, well, you're just tasting your own poison, literally. His eyes met hers, now wide with dread. It must be agonizing, mustn't it? Seeing your perfect plan unravel like this. You, who thought yourself so clever, so superior, reduced to this. A treacherous snake writhing in its own venom. But don't worry, I'll take care of you with the same. Tender, loving care you devoted to my mother. After all, we're family, aren't we? With deliberately slow movements, Lucas picked up his phone and dialed for emergency. His eyes fixed on Madeline as she writhed on the floor. Please, come quickly. His voice trembled with perfectly feigned concern. My beloved wife, she seems to have had a terrible reaction to her beauty medications. She was fine just a few minutes ago, took her medicines as she always does, and then suddenly, he paused dramatically, allowing a studied sob to escape. I'm a pharmacist, but I've never seen a reaction like this. She's writhing so much. It must be some sort of allergic reaction. While passing the mansion's address, his voice choked with false emotion contrasted with the cruel smile on his lips. Please, be quick. She's everything in my life. I don't know what I'd do if anything happened to her. He hung up the phone and turned his attention to Madeline, who was still struggling on the floor. You see, dear, aren't I a devoted husband? I'm as concerned about you as you were about me. You know, dear, he whispered, leaning over her, you should have been more careful in choosing your accomplices. Walls have ears, and phones can be real traps. Recognition shone in her eyes when she understood that he had overheard her conversation with Diana. The distant sound of sirens began to break the silence of the night. Lucas arranged his expression into that of a desperate husband while crouching once again beside Madeline. Don't worry, my love, he said, his voice dripping with a poisonous sweetness that perfectly imitated the tone she used to use. I'll make sure you receive the same. Special care you provided for my mother. After all, what kind of husband would I be if I didn't return such dedication? Leaning closer, almost whispering in her ear, he continued, I'll set up a private infirmary just for you with the same special medications you selected for Mom. Isn't it wonderful? You two will be able to share the experience of being aware but completely powerless. A true family union. His smile was icy as he stroked Madeline's now sweat-covered face. The paramedics arrived minutes later, finding Madeline unconscious and Lucas apparently distraught. As they put her in the ambulance, he made sure to inform them of his wife's delicate condition, suggesting that she be treated in the mansion's medical wing where he could monitor her personally. The night swallowed the mansion as the ambulance departed, its sirens cutting through the silence like a foreboding of what was to come. Lucas remained at the mansion's entrance, perfectly playing the role of the distressed husband, his hands trembling in a studied manner as he passed instructions to the paramedics about the delicate care his wife would need. With slow steps, he made his way up to his mother's room. In her prison room, Mrs. Joanna could hear the commotion, a faint smile forming on her lips as she realized that justice was finally beginning to be served. Her eyes met her son's as he entered the room, and for the first time in days she felt the fog of medication slightly lifting. It's done, Mum, he whispered, sitting by her bedside. Our dear Madeline is going to get a taste of her own medicine. Ironic, isn't it? She who was so concerned with beauty and youth is now going to know the true meaning of being trapped in her own body. He held his mother's hand, feeling a slight squeeze in response. The lights of Dallas twinkled through the window, silent witnesses to a revenge that was only just beginning. In the couple's bedroom, the beauty pills were still scattered across the floor, like tiny lethal jewels that had sealed Mrs.'s fate. And somewhere in the city, an ambulance sliced through the night, taking Madeline to the beginning of her own personal nightmare. The sun had barely risen in Dallas when a convoy of luxury cars crossed the gates of the Whitmore mansion. The first vehicle, an armored limousine, brought Dr. Fernando Ruiz, director of St. John's Hospital and the foremost authority in neurology in the United States. Right behind, in a black executive car, arrived Dr. Maria Elena Vega, a toxicology specialist from the National University. The third car transported Dr. Carlos Monteiro, a Brazilian neurologist known for solving cases considered impossible. Lucas awaited them at the main entrance, his dark circles betraying a sleepless night. His expression, however, carried a steely determination. "Doctors, I'm immensely grateful that you came with such urgency," he said, leading them inside. "As I explained to Dr. Ruiz, my mother was the victim of an elaborate attempted murder. I need you to reverse what was done to her." The group made their way up to the infirmary room where Mrs. Joanna was admitted. Dr. Ruiz immediately began examining the monitors and medical records, while Dr. Vega collected samples of the medications administered. Dr. Monteiro approached the bedside, carefully observing Joanna's reactions. "Mr. Whitmore," he called out, "your mother is trying to communicate with us. Her eyes are consciously following our movements." Dr. Vega, after a preliminary analysis of the medications, let out an exclamation of surprise. "This is absolutely criminal," she declared, holding up one of the vials. "This combination of sedatives and neuroblockers, whoever prescribed this knew exactly what they were doing. It's a formula specifically developed to keep the patient aware but unable to communicate or move." Dr. Ruiz examined the previous test results, his expression growing graver with every page he turned. "These results were clearly tampered with," he stated, showing Lucas the inconsistencies. "Someone with in-depth medical knowledge manipulated this data to justify a treatment that was, in fact, a form of torture." As the doctors discussed the case, Chloe quietly entered the room carrying fresh towels. Her eyes met Mrs. Joanna's, and a small, hopeful smile formed on her lips. Lucas noticed the exchange of glances and approached the maid. "Chloe," he called out in a low voice, "you are a fundamental part of this recovery. I need you to keep observing and reporting any changes." Dr. Monteiro began preparing a series of medications, his hands moving with surgical precision. "We will start with a detoxification protocol," he explained. "First, we will eliminate the harmful substances from her body. Then, we will initiate muscular rehabilitation. Mr. Whitmore, I must warn you, it will be a gradual process." Dr. Vega approached with a freshly prepared vial. "This is a specific antidote for the cocktail of drugs that was used," she said, connecting the medication to the IV line. "We developed this in the lab for cases of intentional poisoning. Your mother will start regaining her movements in a few hours, but will need intensive physiotherapy." Dr. Ruiz, while organizing the new medical record, turned to Lucas. "The criminal investigation will need to be notified," he warned. "What was done here is a sophisticated attempted homicide. Whoever planned this had access to advanced pharmaceutical knowledge and considerable medical resources." Lucas nodded gravely, his eyes fixed on his mother. "The one responsible is already incapacitated," he replied in a somber tone. "My wife Madeline will have plenty of time to reflect on her actions in her own hospital bed." The revelation made the doctors exchange significant glances, but no one asked further questions. Chloe watched everything from her corner, her hands nervously clutching her apron. She saw when the first drops of the new medication began to flow through the IV. She noticed the exact moment when Mrs. Joanna's fingers began to move more strongly. She realized when the lady's breathing became deeper and more regular. "It's working," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. The medical team closely monitored Mrs. Joanna's recovery process, while the afternoon sun began to tint the room with orange hues. Dr. Monteiro carefully adjusted the dosage of the medications, his eyes attentive to every reaction from the patient. Suddenly, a more vigorous movement of Mrs. Joanna's fingers caught everyone's attention. "She's trying to speak," observed Dr. Vega, quickly approaching the bedside. Mrs. Joanna's lips trembled with the effort of forming words, while her now more alert eyes focused on her son. Dr. Ruiz signaled for everyone to remain silent, allowing the patient to concentrate on her intent. "Diana," Mrs. Joanna whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "The driver. He and Madeline." Lucas held his mother's hand, encouraging her to continue. The full revelation of the betrayal began to unfold, word by word, as the doctors and Chloe listened in shocked silence to the story of the diabolical plan orchestrated by Madeline and her lover. As Mrs. Joanna narrated the events she had witnessed, Chloe noticed a suspicious movement through the window. Diana was in the garden, watching the room with a calculating look. The maid discreetly touched Lucas's arm, alerting him to the driver's presence. "He's trying to flee," she whispered, indicating the suspicious movement outside. Lucas immediately stood up, his expression hardening. "Doctors, please continue taking care of my mother. I have an urgent matter to resolve." Before leaving, he turned to Chloe. "Call the police immediately. Tell them we have a suspect for attempted murder trying to escape." In the garden, Diana ran towards the back of the property upon realizing she had been discovered. Lucas pursued her, his rage fueling each step. The driver knew the terrain well, but the millionaire was determined not to let her escape. The pursuit led the two men through the maze of rose bushes that Chloe tended with such care. In the room, Mrs. Joanna continued revealing details of the criminal plan to the doctors and the police who had just arrived. Her voice gained strength with every minute as the antidote continued to take effect. "They were planning to take control of everything," she explained. "The company, the fortune, everything my son built." Outside, the chase reached its highest point of tension when Diana found herself cornered near the back wall. The driver turned, facing Lucas with a mocking smile. "She never loved you," he taunted, trying to destabilize his boss. "Every kiss, every caress was all part of the plan. You were just a pawn in our game." The provocation had the opposite of the intended effect. Lucas advanced with calculated calm, his years of martial arts practice evident in his stance. "Do you know what's the difference between us?" he asked, his voice dangerously controlled. "I never needed to cheat to get what I have." The sound of sirens approached as the two men began a physical confrontation. Diana was younger, but Lucas had the strength of justice and vengeance on his side. The clash was brief and intense, ending with the driver immobilized on the ground just as the police arrived on the scene. "Diana Bailey," announced one of the officers, handcuffing the driver. "You are under arrest for complicity in attempted murder and conspiracy." As he was being taken away, Diana cast one last look of contempt at Lucas. "She'll get out of this," he threatened. "Madeline always gets what she wants." Lucas watched the driver being taken away by the police, a somber smile forming on his lips. "Not this time," he murmured, thinking of his treacherous wife who was now experiencing her own methods in a hospital bed. Returning to his mother's room, he found the doctors celebrating another progress. Mrs. Joanna could now move not only her hands but also her arms. Mrs. Joanna's transformation in the following days surprised even the experienced doctors. The combination of specialized treatment and her willpower produced extraordinary results. In just 2 weeks, she was already able to sit up in bed without assistance, and her voice had regained the old firmness that had always characterized her. Lucas completely reorganized the mansion. The room that had once been a medical prison became a cozy recovery space, with windows always open letting in the perfumed garden breeze. The roses that Chloe nurtured with such care now decorated every room, bringing life and color to each space. "My son," Mrs. Joanna called one sunny afternoon as she watched Chloe arranging flowers in a vase. "We must properly acknowledge the loyalty of this family who helped us." Lucas, who was sitting by the window reviewing some documents, looked up with a smile. "I've already taken care of everything, Mother. In fact, I was waiting for the right moment to make the announcement." The news was given during a special dinner, prepared to celebrate the first time Mrs. Joanna was able to come downstairs on her own. Lucas gathered Chloe and her family in the elegant dining room, where important documents awaited them on the mahogany table. "Chloe," he began, his voice laden with sincere emotion, "you are not just an employee. You are part of our family." With solemn gestures, Lucas handed Chloe a folder containing deeds and contracts. "The house you live in now is yours officially. Your children have guaranteed scholarships to the best schools through university. And you, if you accept, will no longer be our employee. You will be the governess of this mansion, with a salary and benefits befitting the position." Tears streamed freely down Chloe's face as she hugged her children, who celebrated the news with shouts of joy. Miguel, her eldest son, was already making plans for medical school, while Lupita hugged her violin, dreaming of the music conservatory. In his new office, transformed from an old living room, Lucas worked on the final details of restructuring his company. Madeline's betrayal had exposed vulnerabilities in the system, and he was determined to correct them. His mother, now recovered, had taken on an advisory role, bringing her experience and wisdom to important decisions. The mansion, once a scene of intrigue and betrayal, now breathed an atmosphere of peace and harmony. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the sound of Lupita's violin, and the lively conversations between Mrs. Joanna and Chloe, who had become great friends. Madeline and Diana's fate was sealed by the courts. Both would face many years in prison for attempted murder and conspiracy. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through the proper path of the law. The evidence collected by the doctors and Mrs. Joanna's testimonies were crucial in securing their convictions. On the spacious veranda of the mansion, as the sun slowly set over Dallas, the colors of the sky blended shades of orange, pink, and purple, creating a natural painting that only nature could provide. Lucas was leaning against the wrought iron railing, feeling the light touch of the evening breeze on his face as he watched his mother tending to the rose bushes alongside Chloe. It was a ritual that both had adopted as part of their routine, a symbolic way of caring for the present and honoring the past. The scent of the flowers gently rose into the air, mingling with the freshness of the newly cut grass, reminding everyone that even after the darkest storms, the sun always finds its way to shine again. Mrs. Carmen's hands, though marked by time, moved delicately as she carefully pruned each branch of the rose bushes. Chloe, by her side, held a small basket where she placed the fallen petals, smiling from time to time as she listened to the matriarch's advice. Chloe, always cut on a diagonal so the flowers can breathe better and grow stronger, Mrs. Carmen would say, with the soft authority of one who mastered that craft. Chloe would nod, admiring not only the lady's skills, but also her resilience, which seemed reflected in every flower that bloomed in that garden. He remembered how that garden had been neglected during the years when greed and intrigue ruled the family. The rose bushes, like the mansion, had suffered. The flowers would wilt without care, the thorns grew disorderly, and the garden seemed a perfect metaphor for the state of the family at the time. But now, everything was different. His mother's and Chloe's meticulous care had restored life to the space. The flowers were more vibrant than ever, and even the birds seemed to sing with more joy, as if they recognized the change in energy in that place. Lucas took a deep breath, letting the perfumed air fill his lungs. The mansion seemed brighter even under the evening light. The corridors, which once seemed to echo with uncomfortable silences, were now filled with laughter and carefree conversations. The kitchen, where tension once reigned, was now the pulsating heart of the house, with delicious aromas announcing lovingly prepared meals. He smiled as he remembered that morning's breakfast, where they all sat at the table together, something that hadn't happened in a long time. "Lucas, dear, why are you so pensive?" His mother's voice brought him back to the present. Mrs. Carmen had approached, with Chloe right behind, both carrying the scent of flowers with them. Lucas turned to them, noticing how the soft light of the sunset illuminated the faces of the two, highlighting the serenity and happiness that now surrounded them. "I was just thinking about how everything has changed, Mother," he replied, his voice laden with emotion. "A few months ago, it was hard to imagine that we would all be here, at peace, living as a true family. It's as if this garden is a reflection of what happened to us. Everything was crumbling, but now it's blossoming again." Mrs. Carmen smiled, touching her son's face with the same tenderness as always. "Storms pass, Lucas. Sometimes it seems they will destroy us, but it's they who teach us to value moments of calm and beauty. This garden is proof of that, and so are we." Chloe, who had remained silent, added, "I believe this place always had the potential to be a home. It just needed everyone to remember what really matters. It was love, loyalty, and justice that transformed this house, and that's what will keep it that way." The words of Chloe touched Lucas deeply. He knew that there was a lot of truth in them. The past was full of mistakes, but it was also full of lessons. Every step, every decision, even the most difficult ones, had brought them to that moment. And somehow, all the pains and challenges now seemed small before the peace that finally reigned. The Whitmore mansion, which had once been the stage of so many conflicts, was now a sanctuary where love prevailed, a true home. The federal high-security prison in Dallas looked nothing like the luxurious environments that Diana was used to frequenting as the Whitmore's driver. The former driver now occupied a 9-square-meter cell, where the only furniture was a concrete bed with a thin mattress and a metal toilet. Her hands, once accustomed to the soft leather of imported car steering wheels, now hurt from the mandatory work in the prison laundry. The routine began ruthlessly at 5 in the morning, when the fluorescent lights turned on without warning. Diana had completely lost track of time. The days dragged on endlessly, each minute a particular torture. During breakfast in the communal dining room, the other inmates watched him with disdain. "Look who just arrived, the Prince of the Whitmores," they mocked, purposefully pushing him as they passed. The hours of work in the laundry were especially degrading for someone who had once boasted about their designer clothes. Diana spent 8 hours a day sorting dirty uniforms, carrying heavy baskets, and operating noisy industrial machines. The hot steam and constant humidity made his once well-groomed face constantly red and swollen. "When you're done with those uniforms, there are 300 more waiting," ordered the guard, a burly man who seemed to take special pleasure in humiliating him. During lunch, Diana sat alone in a corner of the dining room, trying to become invisible. His former status as an accomplice in an attempted murder against one of the most powerful men in the United States had made him a constant target. "How's the taste of the food, driver?" the other inmates provoked, purposefully spilling water on his tray. "Must be quite different from the fancy restaurants you used to frequent." The nights were the worst time. Lying on his thin mattress, Diana was tormented by memories of his former life. The expensive dinners with Madeline, the plans for wealth, the dreams of power. Now all that was left was the echo of his own breaths in the dark cell and the occasional distant scream of another prisoner. "Why didn't she send a lawyer? Why doesn't she make any contact?" he muttered to himself, still hoping Madeline would keep her promises. On the rare visits to the yard, Diana watched the sky through the steel bars, remembering the days when he drove luxury convertibles under the same Mexican sky. The other inmates avoided him not out of respect, but out of disdain for his former arrogance. One of them, older and more experienced, approached him one day. "Your problem, boy, is that you still haven't understood that in here, you're nobody." The loneliness was starting to affect his sanity. Diana caught himself talking to himself, replaying the events that had led him there. Every wrong decision, every moment of greed, every stolen kiss with Madeline, it all now seemed a cruel joke of fate. "How could I have been so stupid?" he repeated to himself as he scrubbed yet another endless batch of uniforms. The only contact with the outside world was the occasional news that reached him through the guards. That's how he learned that Madeline had been sentenced to an even longer sentence than his, and that the Whitmores had fully recovered from the trauma. "Looks like your brilliant plan didn't work out too well, did it?" one of the guards taunted, throwing the newspaper with the news in his direction. The public defender's visits were brief and impersonal. His assigned lawyer barely looked him in the eye as he explained that there was no possibility of a reduced sentence. "You're lucky you didn't get a longer sentence," he said on his last visit. The Whitmore's influence could have made everything much worse. Diana swallowed hard, realizing that his former life had turned to ashes. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The only thing that changed was the growing despair in his chest. Diana, who had once dreamed of mansions and luxury cars, now counted the seconds in his solitary cell, his mind wandering between regret and self-pity. "Who would have thought," he muttered to himself as he watched the moisture stains on the ceiling of his cell, "that the Whitmore's personal driver would end up washing prison uniforms for the rest of his life." Prison life continued to test Diana's limits, but it was on a particularly hot afternoon that his world collapsed even further. The guard threw a letter into his cell, the first contact from Madeline since prison. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, but the words he found were like stabs in his chest. She was not only serving a longer sentence, she was suffering irreversible damage from the poison she had taken. Furious, Diana punched the concrete wall until his knuckles bled. Madeline's inability to save him from that prison caught the attention of the other inmates, who now had a new reason to torment him. "The prince has been abandoned by the princess," they shouted during sunbathing, mockingly imitating his former arrogant poses. The daily humiliation intensified, turning every minute into an exercise in survival. During work at the laundry, the other inmate started accidentally mixing bleach with his clothes. leaving stains that forced him to wear faded and worn-out uniforms. The contrast with his former designer clothes was glaring, and every glance in the cracked bathroom mirror was a reminder of his downfall. "Where's your Italian suit now?" the other prisoners taunted as he tried to sew the rips in his uniform. The nights became even lonelier after the letter. Nightmares were constant, dreams where he was still driving luxury cars, only to wake up sweating in the coldness of his concrete bed. The echo of Madeleine's laughter haunted him, mixing with the metallic sound of cell doors closing. "How could she do this to me?" he screamed into the silence of his cell, his voice thick with despair. The guards made sure to comment on the headlines reporting the tragic end the couple of lovers met. "Looks like your rich girlfriend left you to rot in here," a guard remarked with a laugh as he closed the cell door. The forced labor started to show its marks: calluses on once soft hands, chemical burns from the laundry products, constant back pain. Every movement was a reminder of how drastically his life had changed. During a particularly grueling work session, an older inmate approached. "You know what your real crime is? Believing people like us could ever enter their world." Visits to the prison psychologist became his only outlet, although the professional seemed more interested in filling out reports than actually helping him. Diana just stared at the ground, unable to find words to describe the emptiness she felt. The lowest point came when she discovered her few personal belongings had been lost during a routine inspection. The photos of her family, her last link to the outside world, had vanished. The guards shrugged when she complained, one even suggesting criminals don't deserve memories. That night, alone in her cell, Diana finally broke down, crying like a lost child. The reality of her new life crashed over her in increasingly powerful waves. The other inmates had given her a cruel nickname, Devil's Driver, a reference to her involvement in Madeleine's devilish plan. The name followed her through the corridors, whispered amongst snickers and disdainful looks. "What's it like being Hell's personal driver?" they shouted during meals. Guards found Diana one morning, huddled in the corner of her cell, amidst a scene that seemed pulled from a nightmare. She was laughing uncontrollably, a shrill, fractured sound that echoed through the silent hallways like the wail of a lost soul. Her hands trembled as she tore pages from her own diary, fragments of paper scattering across the concrete floor like the ashes of a burnt life. The words once so carefully written were now reduced to illegible scraps, symbols of her complete mental collapse. On the cell walls, she had repeatedly scrawled in shaky, crooked lettering the phrase that seemed her only tether to reality: "The Devil's Driver has reached her final destination." The fabric ink used to mend the prison uniforms was still fresh on the wall, dripping in thin red lines that contrasted with the dull gray of the concrete. Diana's fingers were scraped and bleeding, the evidence clear in the deep gouges and slowly oozing stains on her hands. The guards hesitated at opening the door. "She's finally snapped," one of them muttered, his tone a mix of disdain and pity. The other just shook his head, trying not to look directly into Diana's eyes, which were wide and empty, as if seeing something no one else could. As they drew closer, the smell of ink mingled with the damp air of the cell, making the atmosphere even more stifling. "Let's take her for evaluation," the second guard said, trying to hide the discomfort in his voice. As they held him by the arms to take him out of the cell, Diana offered no resistance. He seemed oblivious to what was happening around him, as if he were somewhere else, trapped in some dark corner of his own mind. But the laughter continued, a low and irregular sound that made the guard's hair stand on end. "He won't last long like this," one of them commented as they crossed the hallway towards the prison infirmary. In the darkness of the now abandoned cell, the words written on the walls remained as a silent echo of Diana's collapse. But even as the prison doctors evaluated his condition, he seemed to be far away, lost in a world where Madeleine was the only constant presence. "Madeleine," he murmured repeatedly, his voice almost a whisper, but laden with a weight that made those who heard him look away. For Diana, Madeleine's name was no longer a memory of love or desire. It was a curse, a symbol of everything he had lost and the man he had become. He repeated the name incessantly, as if trying to exorcise the demons she had left in his mind, but each repetition seemed only to deepen his madness. Madeleine, the woman for whom he had risked everything, was now the center of his nightmares, driving the car of his mind toward an abyss from which he would never emerge. The doctors tried to interact with him, but Diana did not respond. He lay on the stretcher, staring at the white ceiling of the infirmary with a glassy look, his lips still moving in an almost inaudible murmur. "He's in a catatonic state," said one of the doctors, as he jotted something down on a clipboard. "Probably a severe nervous breakdown. We'll monitor him, but I don't know if there's much we can do." As Diana remained silent, his mind was a whirlwind of images and voices. He saw Madeline clearly, her smiling face transforming into a cruel mask. He heard her laughter, loud and echoing, mingling with the sound of tires screeching on asphalt and the smell of gasoline. It was as if he were trapped in the back seat of a speeding car, unable to control the direction or escape the impending fate. The memory of his past life haunted him like a ghost. He saw himself